Assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Ghayur Hussain and welcome back to another episode of our podcast presented to you by Law Politics Society in collaboration with EON. In this episode, we are going to be exploring the selective application of international law in contemporary politics and Pakistan's role in world order. Today, we are joined by someone who has been at the forefront of the legal research and policy in Pakistan. Mrs. Ayesha Malik is the Deputy Director of Research Society of International Law. She has represented Pakistan at the group of governmental experts meetings on lethal autonomous weapons in Geneva. She also teaches war law, refugee law, and public international law at Lums. She serves as an ecological security fellow at the Council of Strategic Risk. Her research and writing spans critical issues from Kashmir and Palestine, and she has been a strong advocate of women rights and women education in across Pakistan. Ma'am, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Mrs. Malik, your career has taken from constitutional legislation in Pakistan to international forums in Geneva. Having seen law operate in both domestic and global spaces, do you think international law still carries the real authority, or it has become a more of a language of legitimacy that powerful states use as a tool whenever it favors them?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great question. And I think it's really important to frame this in the time in which we're talking, right? So October 2023 happened 2 years ago, nearly 2 years ago. We're talking in September 2025. We have seen at least a year and a half long genocide conducted by Israel against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip in that time. So for me to talk to you about how international law is great, almost all states abide by almost all of their obligations under international law all of the time, would be a bit remiss for me to say that, even though I would say that that remains true. So are we seeing the selective application of international law? Absolutely. I think that that has been something that we've seen since the dawn of time when it comes to international law. Let's not forget the invasions of Iraq before the US invasion of Panama, in the Gulf Wars, and the occupation for 20 years of Afghanistan too. And I mean, that's forgetting Libya and Syria and so many other situations. So I think, what value does international law still hold? And I do think that it gives us that vocabulary of critique. How else do we say what Israel is doing is wrong, if not through the language of international law? But it is not by fetishizing international law and being like, oh, it's perfect, if only it was applied. No, there is a selectivity baked in to international law in the form of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, in the form of them having a veto power, which is why we can't see any action being taken against Israel. And it's also about acknowledging that even though that vocabulary can serve as a critique of Israel, as a critique of any state, including Russia, including Myanmar, and what they're doing currently in terms of current conflicts, it can also serve as justification. So Israel constantly is saying, we have the right to self-defense. Where does that right to self-defense end? Those are questions that international lawyers are grappling with. And I think that we are at a moment of inherent cynicism with the international legal order. And I think that we should use that to, capitalize on and galvanize us to create a new world order which better represents the views of the global south, but also better represents what the law should be of war, given what we've seen Israel do to Gaza every day for the period of nearly 2 years now.
Yes, ma'am. And you mentioned Palestine, so I have something same. Like if you talk about the Ukraine and Russia war, it has made headlines globally, and they have taken legal action immediately. But in case of Palestine, we see that the interest of the international law and the application remains very vague. So, what do you think this selective enforcement of international law in case of Kashmir, and in case of Palestine, and in case of the Ukraine and Russia war?
So I think when it comes to Russia-Ukraine, I think that we saw Ukraine go to the International Court of Justice, that we saw them go to the International Criminal Court. And we saw pronouncements to that effect, in the sense that the ICJ immediately in its preliminary orders ordered a ceasefire, right? We saw the same thing happen with Israel and what it was doing in the Gaza Strip. Now, Palestine is not yet a state, or some would argue that it's not yet a state. I would be one of them to argue that it's not. It can't really take those measures the same way that Ukraine could. Yet we saw South Africa take Israel to the ICJ. We saw preliminary orders come out in there too. We saw arrest warrants being issued by the International Criminal Court as well. So in terms of, has there been hypocrisy by the international community? Yes, by the West. But in terms of, have the courts functioned as they should have I think that they have. And I think that we can look at that in the sense of the ICC arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant in the same way that we had an arrest warrant against Putin. We can also see that in the International Court of Justice in its preliminary orders when it came to South Africa versus Israel and when it comes to Russia-Ukraine. The main issue there was a lack of a ceasefire when it came to South Africa versus Israel. But the key issue also before the court was that Hamas was not a party to that case, right? So it could not really order a ceasefire when one party to the conflict is not part of the case. So I think that the court had a number of issues to grapple with. They did eventually order a geographically constrained ceasefire in the case of the Rafah invasion. I think largely the issue has been that of power. So Russia has been able to get away with its invasion of Ukraine despite the fact that it has not had the West backing because it had the backing of the global South. And we can see that in the form of the UAE, India, and China continuing to buy Russian oil. When it comes to Israel, Israel is a much stronger party in and of itself, but it also has that Western power standing with it. Primarily, it has the only superpower in the world standing with it, which is a big deal in this day and age. And they also kind of have the ability now, we're saying, to go it by itself. And that's something that you need the entire international community to come around and do something to stop that state. So it is all well and good to blame international law. In the international law forums that you have set up have done exactly what you have set them up to do. They don't have superpowers. They have the power to issue a piece of paper and say that this is wrong. They've done that in all of these cases. The key issue has been that there is no international community which is saying that this is wrong. And I think largely I would also put that down to states which claim to care a lot about the Palestinian cause. So when we're looking at Arab states, when we're looking at non-Arab Muslim states, including Pakistan, it's like there are a lot of measures that can be taken outside of law politically, which would put pressure on the US, it would put pressure on Israel. You don't want to take them, you can't then blame international law. That's how I look at it.
Yes, ma'am. You said that the international institutions, they are not operating, or their application or their implementation is not an application to all the states. So, ma'am, I am from Gilgit-Baltistan, which is included in the disputed territory of the Kashmir, and we are not having the legal rights in Pakistan as a province, or the other rights that other provinces of Pakistan are having. So, if I look at these international institutions or the international law, I have almost lost belief that if any solution would be of any benefit for us. So how would you say that if we look at resistance movements from Kashmir or from Gilgit-Baltistan or from Palestine, these it doesn't stop at only at global attention. It frames and it makes a certain type of discourse that shapes the memory and history of other people, how the
Definitely.
Western people and how the other world looks at these events. So will you say that these international laws, they originate from the Western philosophical traditions? So how much impact they have on these international laws?
Okay, let me pick apart that question. That was a really, really good question. There are so many aspects to it. Let me start by talking about Gilgit-Baltistan and the fact that it has not become a province yet. I do not believe that Gilgit-Baltistan should be included as a disputed territory as part of Kashmir. I don't think that GB is Kashmir, and I think that the state of Pakistan has made a huge mistake in lumping those two together, right? You had them lumped together in 1947. You had Owen Dixon, who was one of the UN advisors, come out, and he was like, these territories are light years apart. They don't share the same religion. They don't share the same geography. They don't share the same language. They don't really share the same culture. Why are they being put together? And I think the fact that since then you had a Supreme Court decision also which put GB in with AJK and said this is all disputed territory. GB, I don't believe, is disputed territory. I believe that that disputed territory remains Kashmir only and not GB. And so GB should have been provincialized. It should have been mainstreamed as a province, as the fifth province of the state, which is actually what I think people from GB want. They want to be mainstream. They want to be a province of Pakistan. And so I think that the state has really missed out on an opportunity to spend decades differentiating these territories and being like, no, this is Pakistan proper, this is not disputed territory, and we should mainstream that. When it comes to looking at resistance movements, when it comes to Palestine, when it comes to Kashmir, when it comes to other resistance movements that we've seen over time, I do like to say that international law is usually a step behind. And so I think that international law usually catches up once those resistance movements have won. And we've seen that in the era of decolonization, right? So are we getting resistance movements? Are we giving them all of the status that we could under international law? No, we need to flesh out what the right to resistance means. Yet you had the Franco-Algerian War in the 1960s, right? And the FLN was hailed as the legitimate representatives of the Algerian people. They fought France for victory. It was one of the longest standing colonial wars in history, fighting against France for that. And again, a lot of the parallels between Hamas and Israel and the conversations we're having there, I see with the FLN in Algeria and what they were doing with France, in the sense that they were also targeting civilians, which now we know is, we've always known is unequivocally wrong. So their tactics were also what we would now call terror tactics in targeting civilians.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम। लोग बार बार एक सवाल पूछते हैं कि कौन सी बुक्स मैं शौक से पढ़ता हूँ, तो हमने ये सोचा कि इंशाल्लाह हम एक बुक क्लब बना लें जिसके अंदर माहवार हम एक किताब को कवर करें, और ये मंथली 4 क्लासेस बनेंगी इंशाल्लाह। इसके अंदर हम 12 किताबें एक साल के अंदर कवर करेंगे। एक लिस्ट है बुक्स की, मैं आपको यहाँ डिस्प्ले कर देता हूँ, और ये टेंटेटिव लिस्ट है। इसमें मैंने कुछ इकोनॉमिक्स की किताबें रखी है, कुछ पॉलिटिकल साइंस की, और कुछ थोड़ी जो नॉटी गवर्नमेंट्स की जो मिसगिविंग्स होती हैं और उनके ऊपर जो इन्वेस्टिगेटिव जर्नलिस्ट ने काम किया हुआ है। हमारी क्लासेस जो होंगी वो एंटरटेनिंग होंगी, फन होंगी, लेकिन सब्जेक्ट मैटर जो है सीरियस होगा। मैं रेकमेंड करूंगा कि आप फिजिकली ज्वाइन करें। लेकिन अगर आपको फिजिकली ज्वाइन करने में दिक्कत आती है, ना आप पाकिस्तान में नहीं है, आप लाहौर में नहीं है, तो उनके लिए फिर जूम की ऑप्शन अवेलेबल है और उनको इक्वली एज मच एक्सेस मिलेगा बुक क्लब का। इनकी हम एक सेपरेट व्हाट्सएप कम्युनिटी भी बना देंगे आपकी, ताकि हम वहाँ पे नोट्स भी शेयर कर पाएं और इन बुक्स को तफसील में डिस्कस करके होपफुली वी मेक फ्रेंड्स एज वेल इंशाल्लाह। तो इसकी फीस जो मुकर्रर है आप वेबसाइट पे देख सकते हैं, यहाँ पे आपको लिंक मिल जाएगा। तो आई होप टू सी यू देयर एट द बुक क्लब इंशाल्लाह। सी यू सून।
But they were still the legitimate representatives of the Algerian people, right? And they were still the ones who achieved independence for Algeria. When it came to 1977, the newly decolonized states went to Geneva and drafted the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions. And there they had in many provisions which gave resistance movements status, right? So they said that if you're fighting against a colonial power, you get to have, for instance, prisoner of war status, which is incredibly important in international law. It was their way of saying these people ought to have all of these protections because they're fighting this war for a just cause, right? It's just war theory as well. That happened in 1977 after the world had seen a lot of decolonization. Right now, Palestine is one of the remaining colonial entities in the world, one of the only ones which was a mandated territory from the 1920s, and has not had acceptance of its statehood, and it has not had acceptance of its resistance as amounting to its freedom. And so I think usually when it comes to international law, you have these galvanizing moments where the global south comes to events like that and says, no, we need to negotiate in our favor. Right now, you have a global south which is incredibly anemic on the legal front, right? There's such little research, such little capacity coming out of the global south to say what should be owed to resistance movements. There needs to be so much scholarship to push that debate that way. And I think that we need to get to the point where it's there, because I think especially when it comes to resistance movements, these countries have been colonial powers, so they don't want to recognize that, whereas we have been the colonized powers, and so we want to recognize those resistance movements. And I think that will come, usually, I say, with international law, it comes after the resistance movements have won. So really what we need is the resistance to win in Palestine, and then we can see a whole lot of law which protects that resistance movement. And I think right now, really, we're at a kind of tipping point of international law where I think the global south is still anemic, but needs to wake up and recognize its power in pushing and progressively developing legal norms.
Ma'am, you talked about Palestine and Gaza movements. So if we talk about resistance movements, the people don't have so much agency, and there are many displacements taking place in the Middle East and South Asia. If you look at take example of the Afghanistan and Palestine, they have been taking asylum for many years. So do you think that the human rights frameworks, they are designed to provide them some kind of power, some kind of support, or do you think it's just for the sake of international support?
So I think that I don't engage in human rights law, so I don't do that much work on that. I have done work on refugee law. It is very different when it comes to the Palestine-Gaza Strip issue, in terms of a kind of different legal framework applies there. But yeah, they are refugees, the ones especially who were evicted from their homes in the Nakba. We know that 750,000 of those. When it comes to displacement in the Palestine context, I just want to be clear, because I do a lot of this in terms of international criminal law. If we're saying that Israel is ethnically cleansing the Gaza Strip, they are not committing genocide, right? That is an admission that they're not committing genocide. I know that this is like part of the political conversation around what's happening in Gaza. If you are pushing out a group from a territory, you are not destroying them. So even when it came to the Holocaust, it was after 1941, before the policy of the Nazis was to drive out the Jews. After 1941, they were like, we keep on driving them out, they keep on coming back. Now what we're going to do is close our borders and we're going to destroy them. That is when a genocide started, 1941. And when it comes to Israel and Gaza, the fact that they're not pushing them out of the Gaza Strip, they're not allowing them to leave the Gaza Strip, means that it could be a genocide. It's not ethnic cleansing until they try and evince that intention to move them out, right? There's a huge difference between displacement and destruction. This is one of those categorization issues of international law. Secondly, when it comes to the Afghan refugee issue, I do think that global South countries have suffered by the fact that they have not created the situations in which refugees are formed. These situations are largely created by the global North countries. So they come and they do wars of invasion in country and do regime change wars in Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, and Iraq, and then there are refugees from those countries, and they don't have to deal with those problems, right? So Pakistan is the primary one, and Iran, dealing with the issue of Afghan refugees. And I think it's been very interesting because Germany has said Pakistan should not be removing Afghan refugees and should not be deporting Afghan refugees, which I completely agree with. But at the same time, Germany has said that those ones that remain, that we promised we would give asylum to, we might not give them asylum, but you shouldn't kick them out and send them back to Afghanistan. So again, we see a complete lethargical approach to Afghan refugees. Nobody cares about the Afghan situation anymore. They've kind of washed their hands of it from the West. And yet at the same time, there is a burden on Pakistan to continue hosting, in terms of that responsibility of hosting. Do I think that the answer to the Afghan refugee problem is to send them back? No, I think that the answer is to normalize them. I think it's to nationalize them. And I think it's to tax them for your economy and to watch them for your national security if those are your issues. The total numbers of Afghan refugees are probably 2 million, 3 million. In a country of 220 million, it's not that many. And I think that they've largely been used as a pawn between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And I think that there are strong national security and tax reasons why you should normalize their stay. But in terms of getting lectures from countries like Germany about how Pakistan is treating Afghan refugees, and especially in light of what they're doing with the genocide, I think really human rights law, I don't personally believe in it very much. I'm not a big proponent of human rights law, and I don't believe that it applies in wartime either. And I think really it's because of this hypocrisy that we keep on seeing from these countries. And I think I think they should spare us their lectures.
यस मैम, तो अगर मैं कन्वर्सेशन को थोड़ा पाकिस्तान सेंट्रिक बनाऊं, और जैसे कि मैंने पहले भी बात किया कि मुझे इन इंस्टीट्यूशन से मतलब बिलीफ उठ गया है मेरा, तो हम अगर पाकिस्तान के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में बात करें तो जिस तरह हमारी फाइनेंशियल और अकाउंटेबिलिटी इंस्टीट्यूशंस वर्क करते हैं, तो हमारे जो फाइनेंस बजट होता है या वो होता है, हम लोग समझते हैं कि बाहर से IMF या FATF हमारी जो ग्रे लिस्टिंग होती रही है पिछले सालों में, और हमारे जितने भी रिसेंट बजट्स हैं वो सारे IMF रेगुलेटेड हैं. तो हाउ डू यू थिंक कि मतलब हम लोग हमारे कोई पॉलिसीज़ या जो हमारे पॉलिटिशियंस बनाते हैं वो हमारी तरफ से ही बनती हैं या सारी जो इंस्टीट्यूशंस हैं इनकी तरफ से रेगुलेटेड होती हैं?
Yeah, completely. And I think it's a really important question. And I think it's a really important part of the conversation which gets left out. I never used to look at the IMF and Bretton Woods institutions, which include the World Bank and the IMF before. And then I started looking into them primarily after reading Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine. And the global North decolonized and left the global South. What it left the global south in was a lot of leverage and control over them through the World Bank and through the IMF by trapping them in debt cycles. The IMF never wants you to get out of a debt cycle, right? There's a reason why we have now gone cap in hand to the IMF for the 23rd time. There was a push from leaders in Africa in the 1970s to create what they called a new international economic order, which would benefit the global south. And they said this would go against what the IMF and the World Bank was set up to do. We would create a new lending organization. We would create new conditions for lending, which supported the global south. There was a concerted campaign, concerted effort by America to make sure that that new international economic order started in Uganda, I believe, would not get off the ground, right? They were offering aid to countries to say, don't ever join this economic order. Kissinger noted later in his diaries that we did everything that we could. We bullied people. We tried to do everything to undermine and make sure that that didn't get off. It didn't have legs and it couldn't really rise. So I do believe that there's a reason why we're going to keep on having IMF debt. And it's because even the IMF has admitted that its policies do not work. Right? They did a mea culpa when they did this in Greece, when they said to the Greek government, do not spend, stop spending, austerity measures, austerity measures, austerity measures. We are seeing the effects of that happening in Pakistan. You do not grow an economy by having cuts on government spending. You grow an economy by spending more. And we can see this in Russia and Ukraine, right? So Russia, heavily, the most sanctioned country in the world right now. How is its economy doing? Not bad, because they have started spending militarily by themselves. They've started producing everything by themselves. They started manufacturing. They pivoted to a war economy. When you have a country like Pakistan, where you're heavily reliant on imports, where you're heavily reliant on now cutting government spending, it won't create a growth economy. And that is something that the IMF knows. It doesn't care. It keeps on pushing this on other countries. And the question is that when we do get better, when we get out of this, what about all of the generations lost? What about all of the generations where, the kids have not been able to go to school because the parents could not afford it? What about all of the homes that they've lost and the livelihoods lost due to the fact that they could not afford to eat at a time because of the IMF cuts in government spending? So those are the generations that we're not talking about that are lost to this. And yeah, it's just to trap us in a debt cycle with the global north. The aim of the IMF is never to help you get out of that debt cycle.
और मैम इसी तरह जिस तरह आपने जिक्र किया कि मतलब ये एक ट्रैप हमारे लिए सेटअप कर लिया गया है, तो अगर हम इसी को अगर इन्हीं इंस्टीट्यूशंस को पाकिस्तान में भी देखें जो अकाउंटेबिलिटी या फाइनेंशियल इंस्टीट्यूशंस हैं, या हमारा एफबीआर है या नेब है या एफआईए, तो हम देखते हैं कि इनको अमूमन यूज़ किया जाता है पॉलिटिकल इंजीनियरिंग के लिए. तो हाउ वुड यू सी कि हम इनको कैसे बेहतर बना सकते हैं और मतलब इस चीज़ से रिस्ट्रेन कर सकते हैं, क्योंकि इसकी वजह से भी मतलब बहुत सारे पाकिस्तान में मसाइल क्रिएट होते हैं.
So I don't know much about Pakistani economics, so I would be a bit hesitant to speak so much about it. But I do think that the IMF's push is to cut corruption, right? There is no country in the world that does not have corruption. Corruption is there. It happens. There's a lot of elite capture, right? The issue is not that. It's not the elite taking all of the money. That happens in every country in the world. The elite is corrupt. It happens in every country in the world. Do we need to cut down on the elite being corrupt? 100%. I think that China has done quite a lot to cut that out. That is a worthwhile endeavor. But I think to trap us in a debt cycle because of that is the wrong way to go. And I think that this focus that Pakistanis have on just the fact that our house is not in order and that's why we have to do IMF debt, I don't think that that's correct. I think that probably those things are endemic, but they would at least be helped by not following austerity measures by the IMF.
And ma'am,
again, I don't know hardly anything about economics, but this is just from my reading.
And another question would be, ma'am, कि if we would talk about the Indus water treaty, सिंतास मुआहिदा, जो कि पाकिस्तान और इंडिया में हो चुका है, तो recently India has made many violations related to this territory. And if you could also explain what a territory means in international law and how many territories have Pakistan signed and it is obligated to follow these territories.
Yeah, so a treaty is a written agreement between two states. It counts as a source of international law, which means that you're bound to uphold the treaty that you've upheld, right? So there are a number of the way a general treaty would work is that you're state A, I'm state B. You offer to send me oranges if I offer to send you the same amount of bananas, right? So if one year I decide I don't want to send you bananas, you would be like, actually, I'm not going to send you the oranges until you fulfill your obligations under the treaty. Those are generally, that's the bilateral treaty between two countries. Now, the Indus Waters Treaty is a very, very special treaty. It was brokered after a decade in 1960 between India and Pakistan. And it was after independence happened. And we were paying India for water as a lower riparian state, which means that we are downstream from India because the Indus water headworks are in Indian territory. We would also say some of them are in disputed territory. And then they flow down to Pakistan. So India, after independence, India shut off that water. Right. And there was a U.S. individual called David Lilienthal who came to Pakistan, and he said, bombs and bullets cannot do what India could do to Pakistan simply by shutting off its water. Right. So it was existential for us at that time in 1948, and it remains even more existential for us then. So we had this treaty, which was brokered by the World Bank. The international community also was part of it through the World Bank and set up a fund as well. And it obligated India to let flow the western rivers of the Indus. They were allowed to use those waters, and it was subject to some parameters, right? So this has been functioning for over 6 decades now. It has lasted between numerous armed conflicts between these two states, and that cooperation under the Indus Waters Treaty has continued. India recently, under the BJP and under its Hindutva fascist regime, has decided that it wants to modify that treaty. So it sent an application to modify. The special thing about the Indus Waters Treaty is that you cannot modify and you cannot terminate that treaty without another treaty being agreed to, which means that both parties have to agree to modify and have to agree to terminate that treaty. So India sent a request for modification. There were some talks between the two countries. We're not exactly sure what happened, but they did not agree to modify the treaty. There is no other treaty to replace the Indus Waters Treaty with. Since then, they've said that because of the attack at Pahalgam, we have suspended the Indus Waters Treaty. Now, that does not make sense under the treaty. It is a very special treaty which says that you can't modify, you can't terminate. And it doesn't include any kind of provisions on the basis that these are not obligations under the treaty, right? It's not the apples, oranges agreement where the treaty does not say that you don't do terrorism and then we give you water. It's not that kind of a treaty. The treaty actually sidesteps the entire issue of Jammu and Kashmir, also the entire issue of disputed territory under Kashmir, because India and Pakistan knew that we're never going to have an agreement if we're covering those issues. Let's take those issues out of it. Let's just focus on the water. So India saying that it was held in suspension is completely erroneous. And also then you had the Permanent Court of Arbitration set up looking at this and saying, you cannot suspend this treaty. You cannot suspend it until we have another treaty that you've terminated with or that you modified it with. India is now saying that it's never recognized the competence of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which it of course did in previous arbitrations it had. But I think that Pakistan really needs to take this threat very, very seriously. I don't think that we should be coasting along like we always have. What the BJP says that they will do, they do. All right. So if they're going to say now, and they have said it before, that blood and water cannot flow together, that is what Prime Minister Modi said after the Uri attack in 2016. Later on, one of the water ministers said that we won't let a drop of water go to Pakistan. Another minister said that we're going to take all of the water that goes to Pakistan and we're going to give it to Jammu and Kashmir. We're going to give it to our farmers in Punjab. And that's the way of the Kashmiris have a natural affinity towards Pakistan. That's the way of driving a wedge between us and the Kashmiris by saying we're going to take that water and give it to you. Pakistan has been very clear in the sense that it has said any cutting off of the water will be interpreted as an act of war. And Pakistan has now gone further and said that if you build any dams to store the water and to cut off the water, we will demolish those dams. And I think that is Pakistan saying that this is existential for us, the cutting off of the water. It provides 90% of our agriculture and irrigation needs. Pakistan cannot survive without the Indus. And so I think we're seeing a very belligerent, we're seeing a very hawkish India. And I think that we're going to see a further belligerent and hawkish India in times to come. We've already had a military operation in our 4-day war in May. And I think that was just a taste of what's to come. I think we're going to see a very conflict-favoring India to try and bully other states and to try and cement its hegemony. And I think that it sees Pakistan currently as weak enough to provoke it into a war.
Yes, ma'am, and it has caused many floods and many climate change issues in Pakistan. So, do you think that Pakistan has some authority or to make it to the international media or international community and take support from them and do something that the consequences of it should be reduced?
So I think some of the reservoir flushing issues that we see with India, those could be happening. But I think largely right now is what happened last year as well, which is that their dams are overflowing and they don't also have an option, so they have to actually release that water. We saw them release that water last year, and again, it's unprecedented monsoon floods. So I can't put all of the floods on India. Some of the reservoir flushing that they're doing, it could be weaponized, and they're definitely weaponizing the water. In terms of international media, I think that we can't really see. We may get some kind of reception with the UN General Assembly if we pose this as an issue of like what happens over water resources. We can't really take India to the ICJ because they have watertight reservations to the ICJ's jurisdiction. But I think what's going to be most important player in this, beyond going to international media, is China. And I think that China has also taken a very belligerent stance against India, to say that if you build a dam, we'll build a dam. So I think we're going to see a lot of counter damming, and also the fact that they've said if you cut off the water to Pakistan, we could cut off your water. So I think that it helps to have allies in high places, and high places in this situation means the upper riparian to India. So I think that China is going to be a major actor in this more than international community engagement.
And ma'am, lastly, I would want to ask you one or two questions. Ma'am, what would you advise about international law if many young lawyers are trying to pursue international law and work on the international stages? So, what would be your advice for them?
Well, I think that Pakistan is a very important state geopolitically. I think that we are a very important state in the global south. I think that we are the only Muslim state with nuclear weapons. I think that in and of itself makes us an incredibly important state. And I think that we need a lot more international capacity compared to what we currently have. I think that there is a dire need for scholarship on all of these issues. And I think, again, going back to the IMF debt, what does IMF debt do? It causes a brain drain. So all of you exceptional students at Lums want to go to Dubai, want to go to the US, want to go to the UK. But for those of you who do stay here, I would love it if you guys did international, because I think that there is a dire need to speak not only on behalf of Pakistan, but to speak on behalf of the global south. And I think especially, I know that all of my students have been so moved by what they're seeing in Gaza, so moved by what's happening there. And I would hope that that would be the catalyst where you guys engage on this and know that your voice is important too.
And ma'am, lastly, do you think that in this multipolar world, we are moving towards a positive change, and these international institutions or these international laws are going to change and produce something beneficial for these resistive movements or these deprived people?
Yeah, I think the rise of multipolarity, and I think that we're not quite there yet. I think that we're on the tipping point. I think the rise of China as a superpower is going to be incredibly interesting to see. I think that the Chinese have already showed that they have no interest in being like the Americans, in that they don't want to talk to you or lecture you or push liberal democracy. They don't care about any of that stuff. They just want to do business with everyone. And at the same time, I think we're going to see increasingly greater tit-for-tat conflict between the US and China. We're going to see the US try and force everyone to choose between the US and China. And I think that the Chinese new polarity, especially in Asia, is going to be one that's very interesting. Whether the Chinese are fair compared to the US, I think that we've tried the US, now let's try the Chinese. But I also think that one of the things I think is incredibly important is that China was colonized. Right. So the extent to which we believe that China is a developed country or a developing country, I do think it might not be a developing country anymore. It might be a developed country, but it at least will be a developed country with a colonized country's anxieties, which is ones that we all share. So in the sense of, are we going to see less war because we have a state which has been colonized and which cares very greatly about maintaining its territorial integrity and not interfering militarily in other states? Perhaps that is what we're going to see with China. Again, China only has one military base in the entire world, and Djibouti, compared to the US, it has not showed that it wants to have that military might. It just wants to have might in the form of trade. And I think the extent to which that will change the world And I think the extent to which we're seeing a rising Asia generally, the West is really being seen as in decline currently. And I think that when the new research institutes and when the new development and when you're going to Korea and China and Japan for what's new in the world and what the new models are, and in the form of tourism, in the form of soft power, that increases. I think it's going to be an interesting world to finally Asia to be at the middle of the map and Pakistan as part of Asia to be there and to be there for all of that. So I think it's a very interesting time in history. And I would put my money on Asia.
Thank you very much, ma'am. आपसे बात करके बहुत अच्छा लगा.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks.